كلام في التصميم هو بودكاست من تقديم ليوان يستكشف مواضيع التصميم المعاصر في الشرق الأوسط وخارجه، ويربط أصوات المصممين المبدعين المحليين مع العالميين لتشجيع التعاون ومناقشة الأمور الإبداعية والثقافية والفكرية.
Talks on Design podcast by Liwan explores contemporary design themes across the Middle East and beyond. Featuring pioneering Qatari creators, the podcast connects local and global design voices and encourages collaboration and commentary on creative, cultural, and intellectual matters.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Al Journal podcast. I believe this is the first episode or iteration of a podcast under the Al Journal magazine. And with you as a moderator for this podcast is your brother and urban planner, Abdulrahman Hamad al-Mani. I'm a city planner, city and regional planner working at the urban planning department at the Ministry of Municipality. I'm currently spearheading the Urban Visions and Policies unit. With me are wonderful guests from all over the world. I'd like to give each one of our guests the opportunity to introduce themselves. Let's start off with Sumayya. Sumayya, can you please give us a brief introduction on yourself and what do you do?
Thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be in conversation with you and also with Ali and Hamid. I'm such big fans of all of you, so thank you so much again. I'm Sumayya Vally. I'm an architect from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm currently based between Joburg, London, and the UAE. And most of my projects are in Africa at the moment. Our practice is Johannesburg born, bred, formed, and shaped, and was really started at the beginning with the intent and the focus to find design language and design expressions for my own city, Johannesburg. And that's more broadly expanded into thinking about expressions of place in all of the places that I work. And somehow all of our projects have found a way to express relationships between places. So for example, we're working on a project in Nairobi at the moment that is very much about Nairobi's or Kenya's relationship to the UK as a former colony of the UK. And like that, most of our projects and most of our work, our project in Belgium very much has become about Belgium's relationship to the Congo, and our project pays homage to one of the first Congolese migrants to study in that country. And like that, in each of our projects, we really are thinking about axes of movement and relationships between places.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sumayya. Let's move on to Ali and Hamid from civil architecture. Could you tell us a little bit about civil architecture as a practice as well? And sort of let's also touch upon the theme of design and resilience, which is the focus of today's episode.
Sure. Maybe I'll start off with an introduction. My name is Hamad Al-Khamseen, and together with Ali Ismail Karimi, we're architects and we're the co-founders and I guess principals of civil architecture, which is a practice that is predominantly based out of Bahrain. Ali's a Bahraini architect, I'm a Kuwaiti architect. And by that virtue, it extends to Kuwait as well. We brand ourselves as a cultural practice in the sense that we we started working together in 2015, but officially started civil in 2017. And we found fertile ground within the cultural institutions of the regions, which fostered a lot of the research and the work that we had initially started off with. But then research would eventually evolve into a lot of the questions that would trigger the architectural projects that we would take on and initiate. Maybe, Ali, do you want to continue going for it a bit more? Or if I missed out on anything?
Maybe I'll kind of touch on the resilience point. So just to echo also what Sumayya said, it's a real delight to be in conversation with you all. The practice is, we call ourselves civil architecture because it sees itself as a civil practice, civil in the sense of we were both teaching at public universities, so we're effectively civil servants, but we also see architectural practice as its own form of civil service, producing let's say research and bodies of knowledge from which to evaluate and then to intervene in the built environment in this part of the world. And a lot of those questions come down to, or the questions that drive the practice come down to, well, what does it mean to intervene? What should the nature of that intervention be? And how do we root it in narratives that we find compelling and to some extent resilient as well? We'll kind of allow the segue. And when kind of thinking about resilience, for us, there's maybe the kind of more direct kind of notion of a building's sustainability in terms of its systems, in terms of its electromechanical plumbing and so on, and then there's the kind of the resilience which we think about as kind of the time span which we set our practice in. A lot of what the practice has been trying to do is to think about the time span in which we want to literally situate ourselves in. So thinking about not operating within a gulf that I think has been particularly obsessed with a notion of the future, but the future as an imminent condition that never actually arrives, and more thinking about what it means to operate in a kind of extended present. And so we think about a present that has maybe been ongoing since the 1930s or just before, and continues into this moment. So I think a lot of what we try to do is try to think about how we root this present within a kind of larger temporal narrative, and whatever forms of resiliency we're interested in are within thinking about the understanding of time in this long present. So to give maybe a more direct example, thinking about how buildings are occupied, when they're meant to be occupied, the notions of, let's say, the larger kind of framing of architecture. So for example, recently we were working on a mangrove nursery. And so as part of the larger efforts to kind of offset carbon in the Gulf, there's been this initiative to plant mangroves. And what's interesting about mangroves is it's become this kind of monoculture. Producing mangrove forests as a way of solving this need to offset carbon, but also as a way to remediate coastlines that have been adversely affected by oil tankers, pollution in general, and industrial processes, not to mention also desalination. And so for us, the first question, we were asked to develop a public park, and it's near a mangrove forest, but there was also an existing mangrove nursery. And what was interesting about this mangrove nursery is that it was intertidal, and they wanted to decommission it because this intertidal nursery was less productive in terms of the amount of mangrove seedlings that it can propagate, and in terms of the kind of the survival rate of the mangroves in this nursery. But we actually argued for its expansion because it required no electricity, required no desalinated water or treated sewage effluent. It just required a positioning on the coastline so that it can benefit from the tides. And we argued actually what made that mangrove nursery not only sustainable in the sense that it required no input other than its initial construction was that it allowed you to understand the diurnal tides of Bahrain. And so it was also, for anyone that visited that nursery, not only were you able to understand the mangrove and the first year of its life, which is relatively banal. I mean, it's just grows as any kind of plant would in the initial year. But what was interesting about it was a way of understanding the coastline, its rhythms, and its habitation. And for us, that's one particular narrative, but it completely opens up a way of understanding how to intervene on a coastline and how to occupy a coastline that runs contrary to even contemporary or even futuristic visions for that coastline, because largely the way we imagine the coastline in the Gulf in the present is based on hard line separating land and sea, which through the mangrove nursery, but also through some other projects that we've done recently, like for example, looking at fish traps, that idea of the coastline is not so clear cut. And in fact, a lot of the history of the region comes from the fact that the coastline is this meandering entity which spans 200, 300 meters at low tide even. And so I give this as a long kind of winded question about resilience, but specifically through this project, the question of resilience becomes a way of opening up the idea of, well, how do I inhabit? What are the time spans I inhabit in? It's the daily 2 high tides, 2 low tides of the day, but it's also the moon phases which create neap and spring tides, and then there's also the high kind of 20-year floodplain or flood levels. And so suddenly, what I think about is the time spans in which I'm designing are changed, and I can optimize, but also consider the sensitivities to different forms of inhabitation. in this case for a mangrove, but also arguing about the way Bahrainis or people going to a public park shouldn't have the coastline. And so for us, it's this kind of working and this kind of undoing of narratives and the product of maybe a 20th century planning that feels like it's a direction that we want to take our practice, but also allows for this kind of durability and a way of thinking about identity and the way we gather in these spaces, but not as a kind of new condition, but almost as a way of remediating this extended present. Maybe long answer, but
no, Ali, that's a wonderful and brilliant answer. In all honesty, I think a lot of times whenever we talk about resilience, we tend to view it only from like a technological perspective. I think, as you alluded to the beginning of your answer, sort of like thinking about it from a traditional like building sustainability type of view. But resilience is also equally about identity. And I think the exact words that you used were hard lines separating land and sea. Oftentimes we think about the Khaliji identity, even, you know, the way that we articulate our national museums, etc. We tend to hyper focus on this idea of barra and bahar, or desert and ocean. But you know, it's the Khaliji culture is really a mixture of the two, right? So I would argue that the resilience is also about how we express our identity, how we feel, gather in public spaces, how you find dignity in public spaces. I'm going to orient this question back to Sumayya. So what does resilient design mean and look to you on a personal level, or even just within your practice?
I think for me, resilience, in a very, very standard definition, is what stands the test of time and what passes down from generation to generation. I'm from South Africa, and we grew up in a landscape that was very much shaped around inequality and shaped around, you know, certain people being allowed more dignity than others, around structures being structures really affirming our places in social hierarchies. And from that perspective, apartheid is an incredibly resilient structure, because South Africa is still statistically the most unequal society in the world. And our society was really designed with that purpose and with that in mind. And even, you know, 3 decades and a little bit on from democracy, with us having so many incredible policies for economic reform that our country has really taken on board. We have the most progressive, we have one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive constitution in the world in terms of what we are afforded in terms of human rights, in terms of dignities, in terms of design even. But because apartheid is so resilient, that is something that still perpetuates our day-to-day. And I know that that is a negative definition of resilience, but it's one that is very much foremost in my mind, because I think if we can understand the power of urban planning, infrastructure, architecture, and design to segregate us to that level, to perpetuate such resilient legacies for negative purposes and ends, then of course we also have to understand that by the same token, infrastructure, architecture, urban planning, design can be used as a force for the opposite, a force to bring us together, a force to sustain cultural identities, heritages, legacies. And of course, these things are all intertwined and interconnected. So I'm interested in resiliences and resistances that work despite these regimes and despite the systems and forces around us. And a lot of times my work is thinking about and interested in, you know, if I think about Johannesburg, all of the richnesses and the cultural lives and the mythologies and belief systems that exist above, on top of, inside of, in and amongst these systems that we've inherited, and the ingenuity in these practices, in these forms of expression, from the way that music movements have developed over time to the way that informal and rogue economies really thrive in our city, the way that there are so many systems that really exist despite our built fabric. I think that there is so much intelligence in these structures, belief systems, mythologies, and identities that can offer other intelligences. And I'm interested in working with those resiliences and resistances and imaginations to offer other forms of architecture. That's also, just coming back to Ali's introduction, why my practice was called Counterspace, or is called Counterspace, because I'm interested in these other spaces from our ways of being and our worlds, our African conditions, our Islamic conditions, and the philosophies and intelligences that they offer. And also how we can, because so many of these resiliences there's been an attempt to stop or ravage or colonize them. What endures, and how do we really work with evolving those endurances?
Both of your answers, we see sort of ideas and hints of the legacy of different urban practices. Sort of the word that I wrote here was informal urban and non-urban practices, and how that can inform resilient architecture and planning in a contemporary context. And I think both of your practices engage with the past in different ways, but sort of on similar lines. Sumayya, with Counterspace, you draw a lot from fragmented memories, diasporic landscapes, and places that have been erased, which I think the name itself of the practice alludes to. On the other hand, civil architecture, within your essay, 2000 Years of Non-Urban History, you dive deep in the historical systems of the Gulf, regarding sorts of ancient farm plots, fish traps, desert kites used for hunting. I'd love to hear more on the work that you did actually on that article, 2000 Years of Non-Urban History, because I think it challenges this idea that the Gulf and potentially even the Arabian Peninsula at large, our practices are sort of unplanned. And I think that's also due to the nature of the way that we often engage with Gulf urbanism, is that we always tend to view it from that urban lens. But I think there's a great wealth that we can learn from also these non-urban practices. Hamad, I'd love to hear more of your voice on this.
Absolutely. So yeah, 2000 Years of Non-Urban History was a project that was initiated in 2019 for an exhibition that we had staged in Oslo. And it was in response to essentially, again, I use this word in a lot of conversation, but a frustration to what was this myth that is associated with the Gulf, which is perpetuated, which is there was nothing in the region. There's a tabula rasa condition in which a lot of architects usually come into and impose a lot of ideas onto a context which is ripe for architectural intervention. And anything that had existed prior was previously unplanned, in the sense that a lot of the cities that had emerged initially were these small towns or fishing towns or small port cities that came about naturally, these aggregated mud brick homes, such as the cities that we had seen in Kuwait, in Mharrag, in Dubai, Qatar, and Doha as well. And through this kind of research and publication that we put out, we argued against it. And we argued that historically, the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf in particular has had this history of planning and communal engagement centered around infrastructural development that has existed for not just 2000, but millennia and millennia. And we highlight case studies that we found interesting, that are Neolithic, that are much more contemporary, and things that have predated the oil economy that has come to define the Gulf. You had mentioned the desert kites. Desert kites, for example, are these human man-made structures that have that proliferate in the northwestern part of the peninsula and span all the way into Jordan and into the Syrian desert. And these were built 5,000, 2,000 years ago. And essentially what they marked were these huge guiding walls or stone structures that corralled or funneled herds of gazelles or antelope into these hunting pits. And this is, again, off of archaeological research and our own in-depth research into it. And we understood that these were all ultimately spatial vectors that mapped out this deep understanding of the land, this deep understanding of the landscape, just because of the directionality of these huge desert kites or traps that were created within that part of the peninsula. But that's just one case study, and in fact, we look at the desert as one element. We look at the sea as another element that has come to define the region, and we also notice that there's this understanding of seasonality. There's this understanding of communal planning and engagement with the geography that spans the desert, that spans the sea, and also spans the land for agricultural practices. And through these case studies, we understand that people have planned out a lot of the land. They have planned out a lot of the areas in which they inhabit, which runs counter to the narrative that has been propagated throughout Western contexts as well.
Thank you, Hamad. I think the research and pushing back against the myth of the unplanned Gulf city shows that there was always this sense of communal planning. I think, as you beautifully put it, it shows that planning existed, whether it was within an urban context or even non-urban context, right? And I think that's really important to sort of highlight the question of planning and memory. That sort of the spaces that we deal with are never a blank slate, right? I think planning oftentimes or rather historically, particularly under a colonial lens, we've approached the process of city building through a colonial lens, right? Through a colonial logic, where we sort of apply like a top-down vision of the city and thinking about it in a sort of very utilitarian sense, right? Sumayya, I'd love to hear, how do we approach cities that have been shaped by these colonial logics and top-down visions? How do we reintroduce that sense of communal planning back into the city and back into our neighborhoods? And how can that offer moments of agency and repair in these urban spaces, especially spaces that were never designed for, like, let's say, certain communities in mind, particularly indigenous communities?
I think that those contexts are always there. And sometimes they have been, as you said, they've been completely erased, but that layer of history and memory is still present. And whenever we work on a site, I think we have to ask ourselves, what lines of movement does the site connect to? And by implication, what other histories are involved and implicated in the site, and what other presences are on the site? And then within that, think about which presences should be amplified for the benefit of the site. And also, I think in terms of thinking conceptually, design-wise, what is going to enrich for us the tapestry of the site? So for example, we've been working on a project in Belgium. It's in a town called Vilvoorde, and the site the brief for the project was just to design a pedestrian bridge that crosses this body of water, this river. And when we first were approached to work on the project, it was a little competition. I thought, I'm not necessarily the right architect to compete in this project. It is in a town that I had never personally heard of. I didn't know anything about Vilvoorde. But when we started to read about it, one of the things I read was that it was known as one of the most diverse Flemish towns. And when we started to look into why, I think it's because it was a huge industrial hub before World War I. And that timeline, of course, is when Belgium was a huge colonial power in the world. And I became very interested in how this industrial hub was sustained. Of course, it meant at the time that Belgium brought a huge amount of slave labor from the Congo. And when we started to look at who these first migrants were, we found that the first person to study in Belgium actually just so happened to study in Vilvoorde. His name was Paul Panda Fanana, and he was a real kind of, African Renaissance man. He was schooled in literature, in music, in poetry. He studied at the horticultural school in Vilvoorde and passed cum laude, went on to work for the Belgian government and planted all over Belgium and the Congo. And then he was conscripted to the army and treated, like many of his Congolese comrades, with extreme violence and discrimination. And when he came back from that experience, he became an activist. So he wrote about the conditions that they were made to survive in, the conditions of disease and degradation, the amount of violence that was inflicted upon them, the comrades that he lost in the war. He became a real activist. He advocated for the wages of Black people to be more fair. And he was also instrumental in organizing the first Pan-African conferences in Europe with Du Bois and several other incredible luminaries. And very sadly, he was assassinated in his early 40s. And because of the impact that he had, people from the Congo were then banned for a time from studying in Belgium. And his story has been kind of, erased from history. It's only in the 1980s that Congolese academics really started to talk about his story, to advocate for him to be more widely known. And when we read this, we decided that our project has to be an homage to him. So we started to look at water architectures from the Congo. Again, incredible intelligences in these. So when you see images of our research, you'll see that there are stacked up, carved out boats, and these become almost like gathering places. So they're very, very agile. And of course, they have a mobile function and a transportation function, but they also, when they're stacked up next to each other, become like town centers. So places for people to trade and gather, where communal activity happens and people share news and so on. And I love this sentiment of a bridge as a gathering place. So our bridge is a series of carved out boats. And each of them is planted with species from Fanana's horticultural research. And then I often think about, the program attached to the project and how the architecture itself also has a diasporic logic. And so there is this main bridge structure with these stacked boats, each of them a little garden of reflection in honor of Fanana, where people can sit in the garden, look out onto the water. They'll be able to read some material about Fanana's life and his story, the stories of his comrades. And then there are going to be smaller, more agile boat structures separate to the main bridge that will float along the riverbank. And these will become pollinators on this land that was previously industrial zone, where many people from the Congo toiled the land, and it now has still a very, very much toxic industrial afterlife. So this is about rewilding this ecology. There is, of course, also a metaphor about the dispersion of seeds and diaspora and seeds that are carried with the wind and with the water. And these little boats are in collaboration with community arts institutions and local schools. We've actually already launched phase 1 of this project in collaboration with the horticultural school. But when we presented to the jury, they said that they'd never heard of Fanana, and they were really moved by the story. So they started to publish articles in the local newspapers about who Fanana was before they announced that we'd won the project. And Fanana has subsequently been included in the Flemish curriculum and canon. So he's now in the textbooks in Belgium. And that is, of course, nothing to do with us per se, but I think we often underestimate the role of architecture and its resilience in being able to carry legacies, because architecture does sustain long after us. If we think about a city like London, it's so aggregated in terms of all of the layers of history that we can see and feel around us. So yes, that project in particular is an example of how we can think about resilience socially, in terms of historical legacies enduring, and also, of course, ecologically in terms of the broader map of the project. But yes, to get back to your question, sorry, I think there are always other sites present beyond the apparent physical site that we believe we're working with. And really thinking about what those other sites are and how we work to amplify them is at the core of what our practice is interested in.
I think that's really beautiful, Sumayya. I think oftentimes whenever we talk about the public realm and urban design and in architecture, we tend to, I think we speak a lot about the importance of these gathering spaces, because I think unfortunately in cities that were industrializing at a certain point in time, these public spaces are often the first to be sacrificed, right? In the case of the Gulf, oftentimes public gathering spaces are not prioritized due to the needs of fast economic development, right? I think what's really beautiful about this example of the bridge in Vilvoorde, Belgium, is that not only is it a public gathering space, but it's also a place that holds dignity, ritual, and memory in its design, right? For the folks at Civil, I would just like to ask you guys, in terms of creating a shared civic space here in the Gulf, right? That's rooted in our own past, that's rooted in potentially even our own future and the way that we envision our cities. How do we shape or design these public spaces, right? We often talk a lot about our urban practices, right? So how do we revive a certain style of architecture? How do we sort of take advantage of the type of rhetoric that informed our vernacular architecture? But that conversation tends to not be had whenever we talk about public spaces and open spaces. So what do these typologies look like, right? And how do we think about reviving them or even rethinking them for today's needs?
It's a great question, and maybe there's a few aspects of it to tackle. I mean, I'd say there's maybe three ways which we try to unpack it. I mean, the first question I think that often comes up is who's the public space actually for? I mean, I think a lot of the things, and maybe this ties back to also the question of the future, is there's notions, there's always conversations on the notion of identity in the Gulf, and then there's questions on the notion of the future, but both of them somehow feel like they exclude the other. So the notion of identity usually is kind of a very kind of a national, citizen-oriented conversation, and it's a question about kind of preserving something, but usually that doesn't actually get forecasted into the future. So there's somehow these two poles between projecting a future, which is vague in who it's meant to be for, or protecting a present and past where it's clear who it is for, but it's a very kind of exclusive notion of who the audience is. And so somehow the question on a public space then becomes a very euphemistic one, where you sort of speak about character and sort of speak identity, and yet don't speak about who you imagine using it for. And so I think for me, the first one is when in some of the public works we've been working on recently, we try to emphasize less the identity of who's using it and more about the values that public space should have, and trying to think about public space as a space where particular civic values are brought together. Because, for example, we worked on a public park, and one of the arguments we got from the municipality was like, oh, well, people don't really use public space. And I was like, actually, you have lots of people that use public space in the Gulf. It's just the people that you might be thinking of using it. So, for example, there's some parks near where I live where in the mornings, like early mornings, you'll get a lot of Bahraini joggers, but then in the afternoons, you'll get a lot of kind of families, but across all backgrounds, so both Bahraini, non-Bahraini, expats. And then on the weekends, it's predominantly kind of laborers or workers that are coming in to enjoy their weekend and take photos. And they're different communities, but they can also find different uses for these space. And they use it at different times based on their schedules. And so for us, it's immediately kind of foregrounding the notion that these spaces have different users, and then also thinking about what the values of the use of that public space, because ultimately it also has different communities coming from different notions of public space, and being able to kind of code that in different ways. So different kinds of activities and different kind of communities that can use it, and understanding those frameworks as well. Saying, okay, I know who's going to use it on a weekend, but they'll come for a different kind of experience than someone who's coming to jog at 5 a.m. So I think it's the first question is trying to break down the ideas of what the public space is and focusing it more about kind of who might or why might, and then thinking about building those values. I think also that maybe the second part of it is, and that sort of tackles 2 points, which is the notion of building together different forms of use and also opening up the conversation on who we expect to use in public space and allowing those public spaces to be used by different kinds of communities. I think the third thing is, but this has been the trickiest one, is asking where do we take risks in public design? And I don't mean risks as in risk to someone's health or safety, but actually which entity has the mandate of experimenting in forms of public life? And I think one of the most difficult things is no entity is charged with this. So in the kind of Anglo-American context, you might say, all right, well, the risk is taken by private entities, so maybe it's corporations or institutions that are willing to experiment with different forms of public space. Whether it's a kind of community-led organization that might make an installation or a pavilion, or a museum that might put an outdoor installation. And so there's these entities that are willing to take, I don't want to say risk, but they're willing to experiment with forms of public space and different forms of public life. And one of the challenges I found maybe in the Gulf, or we found in the Gulf, is municipal entities or ministries of housing or kind of governmental entities have a certain idea of a public space and how it might be used. But it's largely sometimes, I don't want to call it retrograde, but it falls into maybe it's not an entity that's looking to figure out new ways of inhabiting public space. And so the question is that, well, then is the onus on a Ministry of Culture or on a museum or something like M7, for example? And I think one of the things that might also resolve the question of public space is also thinking about entities that are able to commission and experiment and take risks with public space, because ultimately those might engender new forms of cohabiting spaces and also new shared identities. And I think that's one of the challenges and one of the things I'd like to see more of. And this isn't even just one question related to public parks or public spaces, but also public housing. Thinking about whose mandate is it to introduce new typologies, and I think the market is not the answer, and I don't know if we have the robust cultural institutions that are willing to take on these experiments. And so I think largely it actually has to come out of some sort of negotiation between the public sector and the private sector. But those are where the identity forms.
I think what you're saying here, Ali, is very interesting. As someone who's currently working in a government institution at the Ministry of Municipality, oftentimes we tend to view these types of municipal projects either through the lens of, let's say, like culture and identity, and how that can sometimes be a tool for nation building, right? And I think historically that's always been the case, particularly in the Gulf, where I think, the work that you've done in your pavilion sort of touches upon this. It's how do we, or let's call it the story that we build, right? Through our city building practices. But I think what you're trying to propose here is sort of orienting these questions and projects around a concept of like value, right? So what is the value that the end user going to have in the space? I'd like to know, how do you start that thought process, right? So let's say Civil has handed this new project. You're starting to think about what is the added value of the space? What is the value for the end user? What sort of questions should someone or should a decision maker at a government institution should be asking?
That's a great kind of follow-up. I would say, I don't want to say the values change from project to project. I think for us, the values stay kind of shared, but the way they play themselves out changes from project to project. To me, it's about the different, maybe at the moment, I would say it's one of the values is breaking down this idea of year-round consistent habitation in the Gulf. So saying, okay, the way in which we inhabit public space, the lives of public space need to be reconfigured, because this idea of, for example, a public park that's primarily used by day doesn't work in the Gulf. In fact, most public parks get used after sunset or right around sunset and after. The ways in which those spaces can be inhabited or should be inhabited also kind of vary from depending on season. So I think in some of the public works that we're doing, we're saying, the public park is also a way of kind of reinforcing seasonal life. And so one of the values, I think, is really thinking about the Gulf as a seasonal entity and using public spaces as a way of building in sustainable practice. So saying, okay, maybe some places where we introduce shade, but some places we don't need to introduce shade because no one's going to be there at noon. So for us, it's really trying to imagine a seasonal life that begins to occupy these buildings. So for example, the public park with the mangroves, where it's designing it around tides, or some other public parks where it's designing it around partially around winter life, partially around certain forms of shading. So I would say that's one of the values, using the public park as a way of enforcing another idea of life and encouraging those forms of life as well. Then there's other values about kind of care and maintenance, but those maybe play themselves out in home projects and so on. I don't know if that answers the question, or maybe Hamad, you want to add anything about it?
No, I would, it covers most of it, but I would actually just add, also challenge it. One of the things that we also need to challenge with these types of prompts and these commissions is arguing for the fact that people do actually use these public spaces. So people do want these public spaces. It's challenging the notion that the Gulf citizen doesn't want to be present within these areas, or these isn't looking towards these amenities. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that somebody comes up to us and is like, "Oh, you don't Kuwaitis don't go to these spaces, or Bahrainis don't usually head out to these spaces or take advantage of them." And then we'd always retort to, the reality is people do take advantage of them. They really do want these third spaces that are beyond the spaces of consumption, these spaces that are just confined to their kind of vehicles and things, because we're such an car-centric dominant societies. But it's an educational approach as well.
No, I mean, I think it's also this question of what is a public space. Like, I think a lot of it's taken. There's maybe an idea of a public park or a kind of green space, and I think it's also this kind of breaking down this question of that public space. I mean, I kind of lean towards this almost early Olmstedian notion of the public space. It's kind of a 19th century notion of a public space as something that alleviates urban misery. And maybe it's the most common denominator, like the idea of it as a space which resolves that question. But then the aspirational part isn't, oh, it has to be a kind of a green space or a kind of whatever, a public park as we might think of in the Anglo-American tradition, or even the kind of later on the Olmstedian tradition, but really as spaces that alleviate some form of misery. And if thought of from that perspective, then I think, so for example, in the mangrove nursery, allowing the shoreline and the coast to be experienced is a form of public space, and it taps into a history of public space. So the idea of satwa, the idea of this kind of interstitial tidal zone as being a public entity, which could be used by members of the community on that shoreline, that is a form of public space, and it was a codified form of public space. But if I think of a public park purely as a kind of cropped, manicured lawn, then it completely falls out of that definition. So I think even expanding the notion of public space, whether it's shared water or shared shading or something that might alleviate kind of urban misery in a different way, it allows you to introduce new kinds of public realms that I think might ultimately be also maybe more interesting or more useful. So sometimes that's for us one of the conversations, like where we actually say, like, actually what you need here is not a public park, but you might actually need something kind of different, or a different way of solving the problem of this neighborhood. And that's one of the kind of fun conversations that we've had recently. Like we were working on a visitor center, and the imaginary was initially, or like a visiting area, and then imaginary was actually a park, and the pitch eventually became a roof, because what was needed was actually kind of a large shade structure people could gather in, and not a green space. I mean, it's specific to that project, but again, it's thinking about these different forms of kind of public realms.
No, I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it just goes to show the importance of looking at our architectural and urban practices beyond just the realm of like object making or creating spaces, right? Oftentimes we also need to sort of educate I think the entities that we're engaged with, that at the end of the day, there are real end users who are not sometimes the people we think about whenever we design these spaces, right? And I think that's what's really cool about both of your practices at Counterspace and at Civil, is that you're engaged in research, you're engaged in writing, you're engaged in cultural critique and participating at all these different sorts of cultural events as well. And it's almost as if we treat architecture or sorts of urban design and urban practices as a type of methodology, right? So how do we treat, or how do we expand the role of city building and architecture to become more resilient and become more relevant? Sumayya, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think just reflecting on what Ali said about what we recognize as public space, I think I certainly also never think about the kind of normative Western definition of what a public space is when we do have to consider what a public space constitutes, or what we're thinking about when we design a space. And to your question about thinking about expanding the discourse of architecture and thinking about a kind of method of practice, by the same token, I also think that there are so many intelligences embedded in our ways of being that are coming from outside what is considered mainstream or canonical in architecture. But really, not only do they have other imaginations to bring to the fore, but they also pose completely different questions for our paradigms, and might, for example, in this instance, propose completely different questions to the theme of resilience, completely different questions to the theme of public space. For example, just reflecting on the kinds of spaces that I think about as public spaces, when I worked on the Serpentine Pavilion, for example, that project was about reflecting London's public life to London. And I particularly wanted to pay homage to underrated spaces of cultural production and public life for migrant communities when they first moved to London. So which are the spaces that become home for people when they move to a new home? And we looked at mapping some of the first mosques, African churches, synagogues, but then also a marketplace where somebody would be able to find ingredients for a traditional recipe, or a cinema where somebody would be able to hear something in their mother tongue. Some of the first venues to play Black music in London, or the Theatre for Black Women, the Jagannarii Women's Centre, where, Bangladeshi women look after each other's children and engage in cultural activities. And to your point about thinking about what is beyond the built, so many of these spaces were about what is beyond the architectural fabric alone. So there are aspects of the architectural fabric that allow people to convene and gather. This gesture of people unrolling and unfurling a surface for fast break during the time of the Grenfell protest, for example, that is an architectural gesture, I would argue. And the pavilion worked to really map out these gestures of generosity and create forms from them that came together in the Serpentine Pavilion that I designed. But there was also something that I learned about the intangible aspects of gathering that was so intelligent in how all of these institutions functioned as cultural, or all of these spaces, functioned as cultural institutions. So at the Mangrove restaurant, for example, in Notting Hill, which birthed some of the most important cultural institutions in London, like the Notting Hill Carnival, some of the first calypsos, the West Indian Gazette, there were these ingredients of belonging that made this place that is a little restaurant function as a cultural institution. And that was the presence of sound and music that came from geographies that people were familiar with, the presence of food that, again, tasted like home, smelled like home. and the mix of disciplines and people walking through the doors. There was this incredibly vibrant mix of people that were always welcomed and allowed into that space. And I think, in thinking about what constitutes a public space, and in thinking about what these infrastructures are beyond architecture, I think there is also method in thinking about logics that are diasporic, in thinking about how, as architects, we are involved beyond the creation of the structure in the creation of all of the rituals and or in the sustaining, I should say, of the rituals and the cultural life around the project itself. And in so many of our ways of being, in so many of our indigenous cultures, those aspects were just very much a part of the architecture. They became a part of how the architecture was made and built, and it wasn't seen as something that is separate to the architecture. Ali gave us many incredible examples of how to think about working with the tide. I also often cite the Grand Mosque of Jannah as an example of an architecture that is extremely old but extremely new every year. It collaborates with the weather. The entire community is involved in the making of the structure year on year that is really made with mud. And there's a festival of the mudding that happens once a year where everybody in the community has a role to play in the plastering of the mosque. And, this is a heritage that's carried down generation to generation with ritual, with festivity. And arguably, the structure has been sustained over such a long time, so many hundreds of years. But every year it is also new. There's a very dynamic attitude to preservation that is not about keeping something static, but it's really lived in the bodies of the community, and it's really lived in the mythology of that community as well. And that for me is a way of thinking about architecture that really transcends so many of the discourses that we've inherited at architecture schools, and proposes very different questions, very different unpackings of the world, of resilience, of what a public space means, what it holds, the stories that it carries, and the life that it convenes beyond the gathering that happens in the building. Really, in the act of building itself, there is an entire convening.
That's brilliant, Sumayya. I think your point on challenging sort of the Western architectural canon through embedding indigenous intelligences, practices to inform our work in city building, whether through the lens of architecture or urban design, I think really speaks to how do we respond to the absence of historical memory, of community voices, of environmental coherence, whether it's through the lens of landscape and history, or whether it's through the lens of cultural hybridity and spatial narratives. I'd like to sort of take that and use it to face a contradiction that we often have here in the Gulf and in Qatar at large. On one hand, we have these ambitious national visions that strive to make the cities of this region the best in the world in terms of the best livability and all of that. On the other hand, that a lot of these projects sometimes actually result in a lot of community fragmentation. How can architects play a mediating role, not just through designing their buildings as sort of physical objects, but also to design dialogue and belonging in these spaces? And how do we use that then to center dignity and resilience and identity within our work? I think this is for everyone, really. But let's start off with you, Sumayya, and then I'd love to hear from Ali and Hamad.
I think just to touch on what I was talking about a moment ago, there are other logics and other methods inherent in our ways of being that can propose different methodologies for how we make architecture that really does go beyond the built and also thinks perhaps not in terms of fragmentation, but in terms of how things can be networked. So I mentioned the Serpentine Pavilion And just to extend on what that structure became, I was really intent, as you can hear, on folding London into the pavilion in terms of the physical design of the gathering structure that we made. But then I was also really intent on folding the pavilion back out into London. And we worked on placing a number of fragments of the pavilion in community arts institutions across London, some of which inspired the pavilion itself. And those fragments became catalysts for programming that we had across the summer and even beyond. I'm still working with some of those community arts institutions on projects as we speak. And what that did is it brought into dialogue the Serpentine, myself, and these community arts institutions, and brought together different publics that weren't necessarily in conversation before. So it brought different arts communities together. It also brought different sets of dialogue together in the act of working on this programming attached to the project. And by the same token, the bridge that I mentioned in Belgium has this diasporic logic as well, where there is the main bridge structure and then there are smaller boat structures in collaboration with community arts institutions and schools, where children tend to the garden and learn about the story of Fanana. And for me, I didn't know or understand that at the time, but I also, upon reflection, think that there is a logic in that method that is coming from something that is diasporic, where there's a relationship between host and home, where there are a number of perhaps fragmented sites that are actually very resilient in their network and in how they work together and how they communicate across each other. And they bring different disciplines, different bodies of knowledge, different publics together in the same realm. And I think like that, there are so many other methods and so many other logics waiting to be unearthed in different facets and different aspects of our ways of being. The Islamic Arts Biennale, for example, was an exploration of a plethora of many, many, many different spatial intelligences and different logics around the very conception of homemaking and home building, both on an internal spiritual level and also as the Ummah, and how we convene and gather in our communities. We had a really beautiful contribution by civil architecture in the first Islamic Arts Biennale, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
Go for it, Ali Hamad. We'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, sure. Sumayya was generous enough to extend the invite to the initial or the first inaugural Islamic Arts Biennial in 2023. And we were fortunate enough to participate and grateful for the fact that we were given such metaphorical and physical space to just experiment and tap into these kind of curiosities that we've been itching to kind of explore. And one of the things that we explored within the context of the Biennale that Sumayya was responsible for or kind of involved in was the notion of timekeeping, the notion of tracking solar movements and its impact on daily life within the Islamic context. So that was a really fortunate time to actually participate in it. Again, under the umbrella of Counterspace. Maybe going back to your question, Abdulrahman, what the role of the architect is within the mediation of all these ambitions and all these ideas that we're presented with as these kind of resolutions to the larger problems that are at large happening within society. I mean, I just go back to the idea of what has happened within the context of the Gulf with the presentation of these visions, which are the Vision 2030, Vision 2025, 2040, as these end-sum games that are going to be resolving everything that's going to be that is wrong within our societies. And I think for us, that's been something that we have fought against. It's this preoccupation with this future, and that has completely dismissed what has happened within our present. And I think for us, that role has been what our mandate has been to operate within this, again, this term that Ali had mentioned previously, this extended present, which is a rethinking of the timelines of how we begin to intervene and how do we begin to operate in to address a lot of the issues. And timelines, going back to this is something that was brought up in the Islamic Biennale context. But yeah, that's ultimately trying to address the original kind of question that you had posited. Ali, I don't know if you wanted to add on to it or.
I think maybe the only thing I would add is one of the things that we were able to do, I think, under Sumayya's kind of design direction, is explore. We usually work in thematics, and so we pick something that we're interested in understanding and learning about, because we feel it's something maybe we're missing or something we feel is an important part of some aspect of life in the Gulf or in the region that we should understand, and then beginning to work through that thematic in projects over the course of a year or 2 years. And we do that because we ultimately like to think of architecture as a way of conveying these understandings or these narratives or this information. And so for us, the Islamic architecture, Islamic art biennials was a way of exploring the question of time, of seasonality, and of public space as a way of unfolding a certain understanding of those things. It's given a little bit more of a weight when done in the context of an Islamic arts biennial, because the context is not only one of just of an arts biennial, but where the thing has to have a certain kind of resonance as an object or as a space, but it also has a kind of ontological weight to it, or a cosmic weight, because suddenly whatever you're intervening or you're doing is given context by other art installations or architecture installation, but also the larger kind of questions of the faith. So what does one do with their lifetime? How's one meant to live? And the kind of practices that come with it. And I think in the installation, there was the idea of using the intervention as a way of kind of connecting people to a certain understanding of time and of the way the year was inhabited, but also kind of using the space of the terminal as a way of understanding also scale. And thinking about architecture as a way of kind of contextualizing scale, the scale of the tent, but also the scale of the year. And ultimately for us, the satisfaction comes from the work being something that we think we learned something from. We learned from the act of doing it, and we think if someone could experience it, hopefully enjoy it without understanding it, but if they can go through the process of understanding it, then it opens up doors for their hopefully their own practice or their own way of perceiving the world. I think we see architecture as kind of the last step intervention. The first step intervention is just an understanding or a way of being in a space, like someone's, what's a good way of putting it? It's the most basic or fundamental intervention is in someone's understanding of the world, but it's also the most resilient, and it's both the cheapest and the longest lasting. So, I mean, the intervention in Jeddah is no longer there, but hopefully whoever went took the time to read the panel and try to understand it might have a completely different understanding of time or fleshed out understanding of time, and I think that outlives the installation. And for us, that's where that's the thing we'd like an intervention to do. That hopefully helps you learn and think of the world in a different way.
Also for us as practitioners, which goes back to the question on the role of architecture and the architect. The Biennale was themed Awal Bayt, which means first house, and it's a name of reverence or a term of reverence that's given to the Kaaba in Mecca. But we were really thinking about that at two scales. On the one hand, there is this scale of the Kaaba in Mecca as a unifying force in all of our rituals, and how our first home or first house is constructed in our daily rituals in response to that. So a kind of internal sense of belonging that is constructed through our rituals and this Qibla that we ultimately always return to in all of our rituals that orientates us in our day-to-day. The other scale that we thought about is first principles of belonging, no matter where somebody is or if they've been displaced, how that belonging and how that community is constructed. in Islamic philosophies through forms of generosity and hospitality, through forms of work and worship, celebration, memory, loss, imagination, how these shared rituals also have a role to play in constructing our sense of community and sense of belonging. And civil architecture's installation very beautifully took the form of the sundial that spanned over 90 meters on the Biennale site, quite a huge project in scale for a Biennale. And they worked with these dials that really were centered around different rituals in accordance with the seasons and in accordance with the Islamic months of the year. So there was, for example, a Ramadan marker that had the form of an iftar table. And the project was also activated at different times in the year during Ramadan. It was also inaugurated with the performance by the artist Muhammad Faraj called Dreaming of a Sea of Rice, where he was working with rituals from a pre-oil economy or pre-oil landscape in Saudi Arabia. And these forces that bring us together, that we convene around, that intelligences and methods are really built around. And I think every project in the Biennale in some way also expressed a body of research and a methodology that has something to offer in terms of how we think about space, how we make space. And at its core, architecture is really the crystallization of ideology. And in the architectures that we've inherited, it is somebody's ideology that goes back, way back when. It comes from some origin about how somebody believed we should sit, how somebody believed that we should convene to listen to a lecture. And there are all these hierarchies that are set up. And what we need to realize as architects is that those things that we take for granted actually come from these deep places of origin. And there are so many other origin offerings that we have to contribute. And Civil's project really was, for me, an incredible and beautiful collaboration about this other offering of starting points of how we think about space, these rituals, the seasons, and the method that's embedded in those. Instead of thinking about the weather as a force to keep out, we come from cultures that celebrate and organize around the weather, and where seasonality is such an integral part of life, an integral part of the resilience of communities. I just lastly wanted to add on that point that there is so much about agriculture that's mirrored in culture. And if we think about, I was reading something the other day about, we have a project on an olive oil farm in Tunisia, and I was reading about the intelligence of olive trees, that they, when they're under threat, for example, if a goat is eating the leaves of the olive tree, that those leaves will turn bitter, but the tree is so intelligent that it's also able to communicate to all the other trees that the leaves also become bitter. And it left me with the thought about what's happening at the moment in Palestine. I wonder, are the trees shedding the most bitter of bitter tears? But there is also so much intelligence in trees, not only in what they can teach us about how to respond to environments, but also agriculture and landscape and how our cultures were organized around agriculture and landscape. There is so much intelligence in that, and our landscapes deteriorating is an extreme cultural violence, because as cultures developed, agriculture and seasons, to go back to Civil's project, mirrors culture, because there were rituals that took place in relation to the harvest. There were festivals, there were gatherings that took place in relation to the season, the weather, the harvest. And, cultures and mythologies are built upon those. And in the destruction of the environment, there is also an extreme violence and destruction of culture.
I think that's a brilliant point to sort of end this conversation on, how we center our work around dignity, resilience, and identity through different methods, starting points, and intelligences, whether that's faith, the weather, agriculture, landscape, or history, is, I think, something that a lot of the viewers or a lot of the listeners at home can think about. Sumayya, Ali, Hamad, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.